All right, welcome back to Unit 4. Unit 4 is going to cover wedges of separation, the Civil War, and then at least a political reconstruction. So we're going to start with the wedges of separation. That's set. Share screen. All right. Wedges of separation, 1850, 1860. There's about a dozen wedges of separation. These come from a book on the Civil War. We're only going to cover the political ones, which you can see there on your study guide. But there are some social ones like the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin and the continued activity of the abolitionists and the breakup, the way the church denominations began splitting up. The Baptists split up, the Methodists, the Episcopalians split up. We're not going to cover those. We're mainly going to stick with political issues. But just be aware that there are social issues that slavery is now beginning to cause problems in religion and other areas. The chief question that fuels the wedges of separation, nearly every one of them in one way or another, is this question over whether the federal government could prohibit slavery in the territories. Now, we've already seen one of the wedges of separation. That was the Wilmot Proviso back in Unit 3, where they had tried to stop slavery from going into any territory that had been gained from Mexico. And that, of course, had failed. So, again, this is about the territories. All right. So, let's start with the Compromise of 1850. Now, it should come as no surprise, this is going to be another compromise about slavery, much like we had back in 1787 and much as we had in 1820 and in 1845, when both Texas and Oregon entered the Union. There are a number of issues that kind of were floating around that led into the Compromise of 1850. One was California was ready for statehood. The population of California had exploded because of the gold rush. And California had very quickly reached, remember we talked about these benchmarks way back in Unit 2, 5,000, 60,000, and so on. And so California was definitely ready for statehood. And the question, though, is whether or not California was going to be a free or slave state. The last time we did a compromise regarding slavery had been 3630, right, way back in Unit 3, the Missouri Compromise. And California lies outside of the Missouri Compromise boundaries. Most of the Missouri Compromise have been taken up with the Louisiana Territory. Utah and New Mexico were also facing questions of statehood. Utah certainly had the numbers by this point. I guess New Mexico did, even though New Mexico won't become a state until 1912. I'm not sure why there's 62 more years, but there we go. Rather than try to debate these issues one at a time, it was simply decided to take these issues and a few other issues and kind of jam them onto what is called an omnibus bill, where you kind of take, it's like cooking stew. You have some vegetables, you have some root vegetables, you have some meat, you kind of all jam it into one pot. It's the same thing of what an omnibus bill is. You kind of take several different issues that nobody's going to agree about and sort of jam them together and hope you have enough to get an agreement. So let's look at the Compromise of 1850. One, and probably the most important, is that California will enter the Union as a free state, and that will have major ramifications during the war. Two, Utah will simply be organized as a territory. Utah has the numbers to become a state, but again, polygamy is what is standing in Utah's way. So Utah will not become a state until the Latter day Saints give up polygamy. New Mexico, whoops, also left as a territory and will not actually become a state until 1912. So California, the Utah territory, taking up what is now Nevada and Utah, and the New Mexico territory here. Fourth, slave auctions were ended in Washington, D.C. Technically, Washington, D.C. is surrounded by slave states, and you could buy slaves on the streets of the nation's capital. That now comes to an end. Fifth, federal dollars will go to capturing fugitive slaves. This will lead William Lloyd Garrison, you might remember our abolitionist from Unit 3, to actually burn a copy of the Constitution in protest. And then sixth, Texas was given $10 million to adjust its northern borders. We go back to the map here. Texas was claiming all of this shaded. So parts of Indiana, parts of what are now Kansas, all up into here, a big chunk of this land, and even all the way up into what I think is now Wyoming, was all being claimed by Texas. And so Texas was given 10 million to scale its borders back to its more distinctive shape that it has today. So that's a compromise of 1850. Again, there's something in there for the free states. There's something in there for the slave states. And like any good compromise, nobody gets everything they want. Now, after the Compromise of 1850 went through, there was a meeting called the Nashville Convention, made up of Southern congressmen who pledged themselves to what was called the Georgia Platform. And this platform said that they were done compromising on the issue of slavery. They would no longer do so. And this is rather ominous because the whole point of Congress is to come to compromises for the different interests and sections of the country. So after that, we have some of the social stuff I talked about. Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. The abolitionists are continuing to do their thing. The next political one is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and that covers, as you can see, this gray section right in here. And the centerpiece of Kansas-Nebraska, go ahead and put Kansas. The centerpiece of this act was something called popular sovereignty, and this came from our old friend Lewis Cass. Remember, most of us only get one idea that kills a bunch of people. Cass had two. This is his second one. And the idea behind popular sovereignty is that you let the people in the territory vote whether their state will be free or slave, right? Instead of having some invisible line like 3630, right, or the Mississippi River, we should let the people who are going to live in Kansas decide for themselves whether they want to be a free state or a slave state. And I guess the people who will eventually live up here. So it sounds very democratic with a lowercase d. Sounds like a very good idea. And very quickly, Kansas filled up as both slave states and free states tried to get people out to Kansas as quickly as possible. It became a race. By 1855, Kansas was ready to apply for statehood, and the vote took place at Lecompton, Kansas, which you can see on this map right here. And what you were basically voting for was a constitution, the slave state constitution or the free state constitution. And these constitutions have been published so everybody could read them. The slave state constitution would have exempted non-slaveholders from public office, would have promised the death penalty for people who helped slaves escape, and so on. But on that day, the voters of Kansas picked the slave constitution. And the only problem, though, is it wasn't just the voters of Kansas. About 5,000 people from Missouri, which was a slave state, crossed into Kansas and illegally voted, and were encouraged to do so, as you can see here, by their U.S. Senator David Atchison. This led some people in Kansas to hold a second election where the Free State Constitution won. And so now Kansas has two constitutions. As you can see here, it has two capitals. Lecompton and Topeka are both claiming to be the capitals of Kansas. They have two governors, they have two constitutions, etc. Now, this is Congress's problem to deal with, right? Congress is responsible for admitting states. But we'll get to that story in a second. Meanwhile, the people in Kansas start shooting at each other. In 1855-56, a war breaks out in Kansas between the free staters and the slave staters. You can see some of the attacks. Lawrence, Kansas is completely sacked, and battles at Osawatomie, ready to sing, and Potawatomi or Potawatomi Creek. The massacre at Potawatomi Creek is led by John Brown, who we'll see again later in this unit. But Brown was an abolitionist. We're now getting to the sort of violent abolitionists. Back in Unit 3, abolition was a nonviolent movement, but now it was embracing violence. He had his own little guerrilla army, insurgents, I guess we would call them in today's. And he was the architect of the Potawatomi massacre, caught some pro-slavers and butchered them. I don't really can't really think of a polite way to put that. Not only killed them, but cut their bodies up, scattered their remains along Potawatomi Creek, put their heads on pikes as a warning to other slaveholders. I mean, it was pretty medieval. And the whole war in Kansas with Americans scalping other Americans and taking ears and fingers as trophies. This isn't Native Americans and Americans fighting. These are Americans butchering each other in pretty gruesome ways. So it's a sign of what's coming, that Americans are willing to butcher each other in these ways. We'll run into Brown again later on. Meanwhile, in Congress, the battle over Kansas will lead to the Sumner Brooks affair. There was intense debate in Congress about Kansas. Both sides, both the slavery states and the free states, were blaming each other for what was going on in Kansas. Very fiery speeches were being given in Congress about who was at fault. And one speech that was given by Senator Charles Sumner from Massachusetts, so an abolitionist. And in the course of his speech, he called slavery a harlot, which doesn't really hit with the kind of impact it would have in the 19th century. So let's modernize this a bit. He called slavery a skank, and those who defended slavery were in love with a skank and wanted to marry her. It's basically what he said. I'm paraphrasing here. A couple of days later, Preston Butler, South Carolina, attacked Sumner viciously, beating Sumner on the head. What's that drawing? So yeah. There were really no guards like there is today in Congress. And one of Butler's friends brought some guns to keep everybody from helping Sumner. Sumner he didn't die, but he did not return to the Senate for 3 years before he would be able to serve again. And in fact, he was reelected. Remember, at this time, senators are picked by the state legislature, and the state legislature wanted his empty seat to stand as a reminder of the barbarism of slavery. But he would not return to the Senate until 1858, and he'll even win re-election even though he can't serve. What also begins to happen because of the Sumner Brooks affair is that congressmen now began arming themselves. So people are taking guns and knives into the United States Congress. And Congress really doesn't get anything done in the next 5 years. Congress, uh, it still meets, it still keeps up with the traditions, but no important legislation gets through Congress for the next 5 years. Nobody's really wanting to become the next Charles Sumner. So maybe the Supreme Court can help us, or maybe not. Let's find out. This brings us to Dred Scott. Dred Scott decision in 1857. Dred Scott is a slave. This is a picture of Dred Scott. Dred Scott was born a slave. Dred Scott lived a slave his entire life. Here's his birthplace in Virginia, which is a slave state. He had spent time along the Texas-Louisiana border. Again, those are slave states. Corpus Christi, Jefferson Barracks, St. Louis. But what's going on here? I don't think slavery is protected in Illinois or what will one day become Wisconsin. No, that's Minnesota. Can you hold a man in bondage where the law doesn't allow it? Well, Scott had been owned by an army doctor, and his army doctor owner had clearly taken him into places where slavery was not legal. Wisconsin, Minnesota, like a little bit of time here in Iowa, Davenport. Clear violation of the 3630 ordinance. Remember the Missouri Compromise line? Everything north of 3630, which would be this, there would be no slavery. So when his owner died, Scott sued for his freedom. He had been held in bondage where slavery was not legal. And he actually won his original court case in Missouri, and then he lost on appeal, and the case sort of started bouncing its way up into the federal court system, federal appeals court, all that kind of stuff. And it finally wound up at the Supreme Court. This argument about whether or not Dred Scott had been held illegally. And so the Supreme Court, and there were several similar cases that were sort of making their way through the court system. And the Supreme Court will often just kind of pluck one, rule on it, and be done with it. So, what did the Supreme Court say with regards to Dred Scott? Right, 1857. Dred Scott is not a citizen. He cannot sue people in federal courts. Right? Now, this has been overturned. There have been rulings since then that non-citizens can, if you've been paying attention to the news, non-citizens can sue in federal courts. How can Dred Scott not be a citizen if he was born in America? Well, in America, citizenship is granted by the state first, then the nation. So if Missouri does not recognize Dred Scott as a citizen, neither does the United States. It's kind of what the court is saying here. That still doesn't get to the issue of whether or not Dred Scott was held illegally. So let's read on. No, and I'm using the exact language here. Okay, that's a lot to take in here from the Supreme Court. Blacks could never become citizens. That the phrase "all men are created equal" does not apply to them. Okay, but that still doesn't get to the crux of the argument about Dred Scott and the legality of slavery, although you can probably see which way this is going. The court ruled that 3630 was unconstitutional because it deprived people, citizens, of their property. The type of slavery practiced in the United States, slaves were property. Telling a person that they could not take their slaves into the territories was no different legally, not morally, legally, than telling people they couldn't take their horses or their cows into the territories. Okay? It is an attack on property. And so that is the court's decision. 3630 goes away. So all of that territory we looked at just a second ago, this is now all open to slavery. Okay? All of this with the court's ruling. Now, Dred Scott did die a free man. A bunch of abolitionists purchased his freedom for him and his wife, and he did die a free man years later. This goes up here. But yeah, the court's decision was extraordinarily controversial, undoing 3630, 37 years after it had passed. If you're wondering what the score was, court score was 7-2. The 7, believe it or not, all came from slave states. The 2, believe it or not, came from free states. I know the Supreme Court isn't supposed to let their personal biases come through, but Well, here comes John Brown again. John Brown now came up with a new plan. He was as pissed off about the Supreme Court's decision as anyone else. And so Brown decided that he was going to attack Harper's Ferry. We're up to about October 1859. Harper's Ferry was one of the 2 places in the United States where they manufactured weapons. Harper's Ferry is in Virginia. By the way, what is today, I believe today it's in West Virginia. But I'm willing to be proved wrong about that, but let me check real quick. Yeah, it is now West Virginia, but back then it was just Virginia. It's one of the 2 places where they manufactured a large number of weapons. This whole complex right along in here was for weapons manufacturing. And so the plan was to seize weapons, arm the slaves, and have a slave rebellion. There in Virginia. Now, he did manage to get into town. He came down from the hills and through this covered railroad right along here. And then he did manage to seize one of the buildings in the arsenal. And then that was about as far as he got. After that, his whole plan kind of fell apart. Like he hadn't even brought any type of way to like transport the weapons, like a train or a wagon or something like that. He hadn't even brought food in case they got caught in a siege. And a siege is what they found themselves in for about 36 hours. There was a siege there at Harper's Ferry. A lot of the townspeople got into this hotel, which allowed them to fire into the arsenal. The building itself is still in Harper's Ferry. They have moved it about 75 yards from where it was. So just be aware of that. And after 36 hours, some military students from a military institute led by Robert E. Lee stormed the building and took Brown prisoner. He was tried for treason and executed by the state of Virginia. Now we come to the final wedge of separation, the election of 1860. The election of 1860 revolved around what was called the Freepoint Doctrine. And the Freepoint Doctrine is simply the question we began with. Can the territories prohibit slavery? The Supreme Court had issued a ruling about this, but just because the Supreme Court issues a ruling doesn't mean you can't keep advocating for what you believe in. We've seen this with the fights over since Roe versus Wade was overturned. The Supreme Court has spoken, but it doesn't necessarily mean the issue is settled. And so the candidates are really answering this question. And the phrase Freepoint Doctrine comes from one of the Lincoln Douglas debates. And you can look that up on your own if you're interested. Candidates, Democratic Party, Stephen Douglas. Yes, territories can prohibit slavery. The other Democrat, John Brackenridge. No, territories cannot prohibit slavery. So Democratic Party already breaking up into two wings. We're also going to have a third party of the Constitution Party, John Bell. They were hoping to prevent Lincoln from getting enough electoral votes to win. And that would have thrown the election to the House of Representatives, where maybe a compromise candidate could have been found. And then finally, the Republican candidate, Abraham Lincoln, who said, yes, territories could indeed prohibit slavery. Lincoln had many advantages. He had not held office since 1848, so he had no voting record to follow him. And if you think, well, a voting record, how can that haunt you? Well, you might ask Hillary Clinton now that her vote on the Iraq War was a hindrance to her in 2008. Much of the Democratic Party turned against her because of her vote for the war. And he didn't have as many enemies as the other Republican candidates. He was not the only candidate. He was simply the one who won the primaries. Again, Southerners afraid of a Lincoln victory, and particularly I'd like to point this quote out to people who say, you know, slavery wasn't the point. These people is a reference to black people. Yep, 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 and yep. Well, we got all of those. This is from a couple of years after. Remember James Hammond? We talked about it in the last. So let's see how this this plays out. Lincoln only gets about 40% of the popular vote, and in fact, in the slave states, Lincoln's name was just left off the ballot. So even if you lived in a slave state and for some reason you wanted to vote for Abraham Lincoln, you couldn't. His name was not on the ballot in any slave state. But Lincoln does take enough of the electoral votes to capture 180 electoral votes, which does give him the presidency. That is more than a majority. Even if the Democrats had managed to throw themselves behind one candidate, they still would have only gotten 123 electoral votes. So Douglas winning that one state, the four other states going heavy for John Bell, the solid South going for Breckinridge, Connecticut, what is that? New Jersey splits its votes, and then the rest. A month after Lincoln's election, South Carolina secedes. It will be followed by Georgia, all of them, Mississippi, Louisiana, Florida, Alabama. Texas will go in February. And finally, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and finally North Carolina be the last one to secede. And these upper South ones went last, particularly Virginia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, because of the economic ties that they had to the Union were pretty strong. So they did kind of hang around till the last moment. All right, when we come back, we will look at the year 1860, basically the first few months as the war is going to, we're going to have secession, and then the war itself will get going. And so I will see you in the video 1860 through 1862. And I will see you there. Have a good day.